Software distribution the old way. Packages and programs. So, big shout out to SMS and to the old way of getting stuff done. We're going old school in this nugget. And that's okay. In fact, let's just call it SMS just for grins, so we don't have to say config manager. SMS just rolls off the tongue that much better. This nugget is okay. So in config manager 2012 that there's this new era of deploying packages or deploying applications. And we think of them as applications. And an application in the new way has more than one or potentially more than one deployment method. If it makes sense to deploy it as an install, I can do that. If it makes sense to deploy it as a virtualized app, I can do that. And I can make decisions and apply logic based off of what I need. Well, all of that's the new way, and it sort of is an augmentation to the old way, the old school way of deploying applications as packages and programs. Now, I'm bringing this up, and I kind of start with this process because, number one, it's kind of easier to understand. The notion of packages, programs, and it used to be called advertisements, but now we call them deployments, is just a little bit easier to kind of grok before you take that next step into how you deploy applications. And also, Microsoft says to use the old way for three very specific reasons. These three reasons don't really have to do with applications. They have more to do with things like scripts that don't install an application. And I actually copied this code right off of Microsoft's website. So scripts for example, defragmenting hard drives. Remember how we talked in the last nugget about a config manager deployment can just be any executable, even solitaire if you want. One-time scripts that don't require monitoring, or even scripts that run on a recurring schedule that don't have global conditions or requirement rules. So if I have some pretty simple installations that don't have the need for conditional statements or requirements or all the new features that applications make use of, well, then I can deploy them using the old way via packages and programs. You'll find, I think, that you'll do this, it will make sense, and then in the next nugget I will show you the new way, and you'll go, well, you know what, that actually, I have to pay more in terms of the learning curve, the new way, but what I get out of it is quite a bit better. So this is not the new way of doing things, but as I said, it's relatively easy to understand that a package can contain one or more programs. That defines the what. Okay, that's the content. What needs to get installed. The collection defines, well, the where. And then the deployment, or what we used to think of as an advertisement, defines the when. So I take a piece of code, a package with one or more programs, and then I link that to a collection full of users or computers. In this case, it's going to be computers more often than not. And then I give it a time that I want it to deploy, which is the deployment. And these three items here link up to create a change event. And that change event usually is the running of a script or the installation of an application. So all this kind of links together to create this old world, I guess, of packages and programs. Now, for that next nugget, when we start talking about all the different ways in which we can deploy applications and the deployment methods that exist, well, one of those is by virtualizing the app. But for us to actually make use of a virtualized app, we have to have the app v client installed to all the machines in the network. And we also have to have a hotfix that's installed after the app v client. And I bring this up here because it brings the opportunity to package up a rather complex package that you may actually need, or you will need, if you want to make use of everything we're going to do in the next nugget. So this is here because it's sort of a precursor to what we're going to do later, and we're going to deploy that app v client using a package and a program. I'll do things simpler also. Remember in the last nugget how we packaged up WinZip? We'll start simple with WinZip because it's a relatively easy thing to install. Down here in the interaction portion, we have a couple things we have to do first. We have to configure those client settings, and we have a software distribution site component and some distribution points we have to do before we can ever get around to the fun part, which is creating and deploying that package and program. So these are the things we're going to do now. What I want to start off with are just some of the hierarchy settings that have to be put into place before we can start deploying software. And what's interesting is that based off of all the things we've done to this point, we are actually perfectly capable of installing software right now. I mean, in fact, as you'll find out in a minute, I've actually already deployed software with no changes to any of these settings. Now, in the default client settings, there are a couple of items here in the agents that need to get just a review. And you don't really have to do much here, just be aware that they're there. First of all is just, again, paying attention to bits. Do you need to throttle bits in certain circumstances? Also, under Computer Agent, these top three here define when deployment deadlines get user notification. Okay, so if a user is approaching a deployment deadline, and you've set up the package so that they will get notified, well, what are those notifications and when do they occur? The other pieces down here in Computer Agent, we're not going to talk about just yet. Okay, these things like application catalogs, they deal more with the new way of doing things. We have to think about computer restarts too. Do we want to display notifications to users, and do we want to have a countdown timer? Okay, or after a certain number of minutes, do we just log that user off and restart their computer? The last one down here, software deployment, it defines when we schedule a reevaluation for a deployment. So something happens and the deployment doesn't work. Well, when do we reevaluate that we need to see if something needs to be done, or if a redeployment needs to happen? So these are really kind of the big ones here as it relates to the software installation, so software distribution. These client settings, again, we haven't changed anything, but just review those because they become important. Now, under sites, we are going to take a look here at actually a site component, specifically the, where is it here, the software distribution site component. And again, there's nothing you need to do here. You just need to be aware that there are configurations here. We don't really that often adjust these, but here is where they happen to be buried now if you're trying to find them later on. These are just some timeout settings associated with distribution of packages and deployment of packages to distribution points. Also, we have to create what is called a network access account, which is the account that's used by the SMS client, the config manager client, in deploying software during a software distribution. Now, back in the old days, there was no default user account that was used, and so you'd have to actually specify an account that can access all these network locations that may make where software may end up coming from. But as you can see these days, the computer account of the configuration manager client now has the ability to connect up to whatever it needs to. So as long as that computer account has the proper privileges to access the locations, well, you're going to be fine. Or if you want to specify a user account, you can do so down here. So that's the second of the three things. The third of the three things is actually the distribution point role that we've added here to this computer. So I'm looking at Config Manager 1, and as part of the initial installation of this site server, what it did was it added the DP role. Now, distribution points don't necessarily have to be site servers. They can actually be your file server, your IT file server, or just any server out there. In the Config Manager 2012 days, we can set all kinds of very rich branch cache accessible or branch cache enabled distribution points, and we can even distribute clients out to individual desktops if we have a situation where those desktops are out in a like in a branch office, for example. So the concept of a distribution point is really, I have a location where the data sits when it needs to get downloaded from the client from some place that's hopefully geographically local to it. And in that location, the data just sits in there in a file share, and we're good to go. So this distribution point, if I take a look at the properties here, will give me just some basic information about how I want to set up that DP. Okay, we've already set it up for HTTP. We're not supporting mobile devices right now. We can allow clients to connect anonymously if we want. We can create specific certificates if we want. In fact, this is an important requirement for HTTPS. There is a notion down here of pre-staged content. And be very careful in selecting this. A pre-staged content location in the now 2012 speak is effectively a distribution point that you will use for the purposes of transferring content via some non-network method. Okay, maybe you've got an air gap between two servers, or maybe one's on the other side of the world and it's faster for you to FedEx your packages to that location than it is for it to go over the network. So if you set up a distribution point for pre-staged content, there's more decisions you have to make and a couple of selections you have to be very careful with later on. If you're in a single site environment, well, just leave it the way it is because you're probably well connected. We only care about pre-staged content, again, when I have either a really, really latent connection or maybe an air gap. If I am doing OS deployment, I can set up a distribution point in support for Pixie and also for multicast. Now, if I do set these up, you'll notice that Windows Deployment Services is going to get installed if it's required. We're going to talk about that later. We're going to get into OS deployment quite a bit later in this series, but for now, here's how I can enable that distribution point for OS deployment. I can now, in 2012, collect distribution points into distribution point groups. And the whole concept of a distribution point group is that I have a number of distribution points that may be in one geographic location, so I can load balance, clients against those distribution points. And I want to make sure I get the clients pointed to one of those DPs, so I point it at the group instead of an individual DP. Again, designed for scalability here, both scalability within a site and then also across sites. Here in the Content tab, you can see the different deployment packages that have already been added to this distribution point. And by default, right out of the box, we get the Configuration Manager client package. I have already added in the AppV client, and you'll find out here in just a second why I've done that. Under content validation, I can choose to validate that content on a schedule. If you're concerned that your content may get corrupted, well, once a week we can go through and validate that the packages are what they should be. Your classic hashing that's going on here. And then lastly, what are the boundary groups? If you recall, we are a single boundary group here, so we're setting up this boundary group called our boundary group. And what this says is that any of the clients that exist in that boundary group are going to point to this distribution point for their content, at least their priority of their content. So all of this gives us essentially that configuration for distribution points. And as I said, right out of the box, there's nothing we actually need to change here because, unlike previous versions, everything's set up for distributing content. So very, very handy in the way Microsoft has actually set this up so that it makes it very easy for us to deploy content. Now, on the client side, over here on Client 1, I want to show you one little element that is used here in Config Manager 2012. We're not actually going to use it in this nugget, but we will in the next nugget. And that is this System Center 2012 Software Center item. So the Software Center item is going to be used when we create an application that users may have the option to download applications and install applications that they need. This will show them the applications that have been installed and also the ones that are available. Okay, we'll talk more about that and the options a little bit later on. But this Software Center, as I said, does not necessarily, it doesn't play when we're working with packages and programs. But like I said, I wanted to make you aware of this so you knew what we'd be getting into in the next nugget. So that's pretty much it. We've got the setup ready to go. The next step we have to do is to actually, click up here in Software Library and begin creating the package and the program and ultimately the deployment that we want for deploying this WinZip application out to users. I'm going to skip over this AppV client for just a minute because there's a lot of steps that are required to get that thing up and running. So let's start with the basic package. If I right-click and choose to create a package, we're going to create WinZip here, and the manufacturer will be Nico Mac Computing, and language is English, and the version, I think this is version 16, I think. These source files are currently stored in a location here on this Config Manager server. And I have to stop here because by default, right out of the box, there is no source files share that Config Manager creates automatically for you. I have actually created a share on this computer on Config Manager 1, And if I go to config mgr1/, you'll notice I have a new share here called source files. You don't have to call it that. You don't have to create a share if you don't want to. I mean, you have to create a share because that's where the files come from. It doesn't have to be on this server, but generally it's a good idea to create a source files share somewhere so that you can store the working copies of the packages that you intend on uploading to your distribution points. Now you think about this. Because I have multiple different locations, I may end up with a situation where I can have 2 or potentially 3 different copies of a package going on at the same time. In this case, the WinZip package is the one that I'm working with. I've copied it from its original location here to this share. And I kind of want to stop there for just a minute because it makes sense to explain why the 2 or 3 instances of each package may end up happening. If you recall, back in that last nugget when we were packaging that app, we were packaging it on, I believe it was Client 1 was the name of the machine that we were packaging it on. That was kind of our working location. And then I have this source files location that I end up copying the completed package to. So from its where I'm actually building it to its sort of staging location here, its source files location. And ultimately from there, I end up uploading the content into my distribution point. So these are the 3, and sometimes even more if I'm working on multiple packages and different versions of different packages. At the same time, I can have many different copies of the same data sitting around. So you're going to have plenty of storage space for all these packages. Storage space in your source files location, storage space on your distribution point or points, and then wherever you're working on those machines as well. So this is the source folder. It's where the data is eventually going to get copied up to the distribution point. Okay, if I can get you, it's very difficult for me to do. No, it's not actually here. Computer, C, source files. There are the 3 packages that I just literally copied right off. Well, 2 of the 3 that I copied right off of those machines that we were working with in that last nugget. The WinZip packaged includes that MSI, and the WinZip virtualized includes the manifest here, the XML file. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. Once I got the package taken care of, remember that the package is, one package can create or contain 1 or more programs. So the package is the content, and the program is whatever things you need to execute in order to get that content delivered. I'm going to create a program here, and in this case it's going to be a standard program because I'm not creating a program for a device. The name of this program will be install WinZip 16. Okay, hoping again that it was 16. I think it's 16. Now the command line, if I click browse here and I go to the location, well, better yet than that, the command line is going to be the command line that needs to be executed on the computer for that package to install correctly. Okay, I kind of showed you this back on that last nugget just a little bit. How you can run solitaire, you can run ipconfig, or you can run winzip packaged.msi. Now when you do, you may want to, in this case, not necessarily run it directly, but run it within the framework of MSI exec. So MSI exec /I winzip package.msi will actually kick off the installation of this package. Remember that I've already done all the work that's necessary to get it in silent mode, so I don't have to put in there any /qb minus or whatever the additional MSI exec switches are to get it to run in silent mode. It's already going to run silently. This winzip package.msi assumes that its location where it begins, so its source location, is essentially the root of whatever I just put in the previous screen. So in that previous screen, when I identified the package source location, that's the root where this is going to execute from. Now when I do that, I can choose to give it a startup folder if I want. I can also choose to run it normal, minimized, maximized, or hidden. A lot of times we want to install these hidden so they happen under the covers when the users aren't paying attention. The program can run either when or when a user is not logged in, or either. I can choose here either just to enable that application to run whether or not the user is logged in or not. If the user is logged on, do I want to run it with their rights or with administrative rights? More often than not, I want to run it with administrative rights. If I choose no user, well, then it will always run with administrative rights. So when I have the user, when I have it with the user could actually potentially see it, I also need to select whether or not I want the users to be able to view the installation and actually interact with it. Now you may think, well, wait a minute, I did all this work to silence that app, and now you're telling me you want the users to interact with it? There are some, I've seen some really cool implementations of Config Manager where the command line that was run was not an application, but maybe a little HTA that pops up and asks you, where are you at today? To gather more information out of the database. So there are some very rare, some very, very cool solutions where you can actually have the users interact with certain things, but they're not that, you don't see them that often. Certain applications have to run from a drive letter, and a subset of those have to run with a specific drive letter. If I need to, I can choose what that drive letter is here. Now, most applications install just fine from a UNC path, but occasionally you see them that have to run from the S drive or what have you. Choose Next. And the next screen here identifies what the requirements are for deploying this package. The top one here is actually pretty important because it's not entirely clear about how you would chain a number of packages together. So you think about that, right? So imagine that I've got a version of some application. And I've got, over here, I've got, oops, not that. I've got here application version 1. And I want to get to, well, application version 2. In order to get there, I've got to go through a couple of different steps, right? The first step would be uninstalling before I go through the second step, which would be installing from 1 to 2. You don't always have to do that. Some applications upgrade just fine, but occasionally we have these needs to chain a couple of packages together. Well, when you do that, you actually make use of this run another application first item here. And then what that has you do is chain up the packages. So you go, here's package 1, here's package 2, here's package 3, here's package 4, and so on and so on. And then if you chain them backwards to run the previous program first, well, when you select this and choose to advertise or deploy the last package in the string, it will delay until you actually get all the way to the initial package and run them all in the proper order. That's, and it's fairly complex in the way that this chaining works, but that's how it works here in Config Manager. If I have other programs that have to run, well, again, I advertise the final package, and then all the ones that precede it will run before it actually gets to that one. Now in this case I don't have that, so this makes it very simple. Down here at the bottom I can choose to run it only on specified platforms. That can protect myself against trying to install a 64-bit app on a 32-bit operating system. I also can estimate the disk space and the maximum allowed runtime just to ensure that if the runtime goes too long or the disk space ends up being too much, that I'll actually fail the package. We can finish things out here and choose Close, and as you can see I now have this package that's set up for deploying WinZip. Pretty cool. So now that I have this WinZip package, the next thing I have to have is a device collection that I end up sending the package to. And I've already created one of these device collections. In fact, I just want to show you this device collection here because it's a fairly complex one, although you wouldn't think that. In order to get all of the Windows 7 desktops and the ones that are Windows 7 and are also x64, there's some fairly complicated membership rules that you have to have. And you have to actually pull this information from two different locations. The operating system resource class and the processor resource class. Because the operating system class gives you the Microsoft Windows 7 Enterprise version. In fact, it's the caption is the resource you're looking for. And address width equal to 64 in the processor class. So this will help you define some of your first collections. And like I told you, I told you in that last nugget that the data here takes some real sleuthing to try to figure out where the exact piece of data that you need is so you can create the collections that you want. But that's good. We are going to deploy this package to all Windows 7 x64 desktops because if I look at the membership of this, well, it's Client 1 and Client 2. That's what I want to do. So back here under Software Library, I have this package WinZip here. And here's the step that everybody forgets. You will forget it umpty million times, and you will curse yourself for doing that. That is actually distributing the content to your distribution points. If you make a change to the package, if you go and modify it in the source file's location, you got to go and update those distribution points with the new content, or you're going to push out the same old package again. Everybody always forgets to update the distribution points. So once we've created the package and the program, the next step is to actually distribute the content. Here's the content WinZip. The distribution points that I want to distribute it to is Config Manager 1. There it is. Choose next, and close. And then in the background, that will go about actually getting it uploaded to those distribution points. I believe if we go here to monitoring and take a look at distribution status, we can take a look at the distribution point content status here. So here's Nicomac Computing WinZip English, and it is targeted, and it is, well, it's still being uploaded at this point. So it takes a minute or two. You can imagine if that distribution point is on the other end of some network somewhere, well, it can take a really long period of time. Or if you're trying to update an operating system image or a service pack, a really, really big package can take time. So before you actually do anything as far as deploying the package, well, make sure that it actually is uploaded appropriately, targeted to the right DPs, and ready for use by the different machines out in your environment. Because if it's not on the DPs and you go and advertisement, well, you're going to end up having a problem. Once that package is on your distribution points, the last thing to do is to deploy it. Okay? Send it out. The change event that we were talking about before. This used to be called an advertisement. And a little nugget of information. You may hear people talk about SMS Config Manager as pushing software. And in reality, it's a pull. Because you don't want to push anything to a client. You want the client to request it. And so we used to call it an advertisement because it would be the server going, hello, I have a package for you. Well, thus advertising said package. Well, they don't call it that anymore. We actually call it the deploy software deployment because advertisement didn't connect with people. So here's the piece of software. Okay, and I have to give it a collection to deploy it to. I'm going to give it to that Windows 7 x64 desktops collection. Choose next. It is on a distribution point. I can add additional DPs or DP groups if I want. I can choose whether it's required or merely available. In the required world, it's going to be deployed. So, yea, verily, that software will end up on those machines. In the available world, well, it just becomes available for deployment. Okay, I have the ability to deployment. It's just down there. It's ready to go. A lot of times with packages and programs, we choose required. Okay, if you're going to make something available, you might as well make it an application instead of using a package and a program. So I'm going to choose required because I want WinZip installed to my Client 1 and my Client 2 computers over here. I want it forced down on these computers. Now, when I deploy that software, I have to set a start time and an end time for the deployment. The start time is now. Okay, and the end time can be whenever, or it can be never. Right? I can choose never to actually expire the advertisement or the deployment. When I choose when it becomes available, well, then I need to also then choose when it's required to come down. Remember, I'm requiring it. So I can choose, all right, it is now available at this point, and it's going to be required after a certain point. Even if it's available, even if I set it up for available, I can set it up for available for a period of time, and then you know what, after a couple of months, if you haven't figured out how to install it, I'm going to require you to do it. Now, a lot of us just choose as soon as possible here for this event. You can choose log on and log off if you want to, but as soon as possible says, as soon as it is possible, as soon as the client has got all the signaling it needs in order to receive and install the package, go ahead and do that. Down here I can choose if I want to rerun or not rerun the package if a problem occurs. This becomes very important when you start looking at error codes for your packages. Okay, a package that will rerun if it fails gives you the ability to tell that package to rerun again. Otherwise, never rerun. Well, even if it fails, you've got to recreate the advertisement, the deployment, in order for it to get pushed out again. So let's choose to rerun if it fails. I don't want my users to run it independently of assignments. Okay, I'm forcing this down. And we talked about maintenance windows earlier and how I can set up, okay, the package is available after 7:15 p.m., but the maintenance window for when it could be installed is between 1 and 3 in the morning. Okay, that's the further constricting down when I can allow these things to occur. If you want to go outside of the maintenance windows, well, you check these two boxes, and the software installation and the system restart will occur outside of the maintenance window. And that's what I want here because I want to do this very quickly. If I am connected to a fast boundary, remember we were talking about boundaries and how there were some decisions that had to be made about whether the boundaries were fast or slow. Well, if it's a fast boundary, do I want to run it directly from the DP or download it and then run it locally? Larger packages, it makes more sense to download it and run it locally. Smaller packages, it doesn't really matter so much. If I want a slow or unreliable link, what do I want to do? If it's a larger package, do I want to say, you know what, don't worry about it until you get into a fast boundary? Or do you want to try to download it via bits? Okay, this right now I only have fast boundaries, but again, if you have that slow boundary, maybe your VPN subnet, this is how you can determine the behaviors for when users are on that network. Also, and this is very cool, if a client is branch cache enabled, can that client actually share the content with other clients in the same subnet? Very cool. Right, there's some other stuff that has to kind of work for this to work, but the whole notion is that the package ends up getting sent down to the client. And once one client gets it, well, every other client on that subnet can just grab it from that local location. I don't have to worry about creating a bunch of DPs. It really improves the whole process of getting this content distributed. And if I can't get access to my primary content location, can I use a failback location for the content? So I can't get access to my preferred content location. We'll go ahead and use some failback, another option that's available. Choose next, and that's the summary. We now have a deployment. This deployment we can monitor from this location here. If I scroll, it's actually up. Here is this deployment. If I double click this deployment, it'll bring me to this very nice new deployment status screen that will slowly end up populating with information as my system goes through its various timeouts. I can run that summarization, to speed things up, and eventually I'll start to get data back about the deployment of this package. Pretty cool stuff, huh? Now you may wonder, all right, so, okay, hurry up, okay, there's nothing going on, hurry, oh, I've got to wait for this. Remember we used to call SMS slow-moving software. The entire infrastructure that is Config Manager is designed so that it can scale to really almost N. There are hard limits, but it's designed so if I've got 50,000 clients that is plugging into this thing, well, I want to set up all of the different timeouts so that I don't end up overloading the server. It's purposely slow-moving software. And so you might have to wait for a while before you end up getting any data at all from this deployment status. Now, there is one way that you can actually go about kind of speeding things up a little bit. And it's not foolproof, but it does tend to do things a little bit better than just waiting. Remember that each of the actions here, based off of the client settings that we've set up, can happen over a period of time. So for this client to actually install the software, we may have to go through a machine or user policy retrieval and evaluation cycle, which could take minutes or an hour. And then once that happens, then we have to go through an application deployment evaluation cycle or something else in here. So there's some steps that have to go through, and there's time bombs on each one of these steps, which end up kind of creating or making things happen a little slower than what they would seem. It's an old SMS trick here to go through and just run all of these now whenever you're doing your test deployments, because the running of these now just generally tends to get things, unstuck in the system and speeds up that process of deploying out software. Now, I'm not going to be able to see this software get deployed because the software is actually getting deployed, remember, in the background. A common trick also is to just watch to see, as you notice here, we're actually doing an installation right now, to watch to see the different processes on a computer to see if MSI exec is running or if any of the other fallout processes that are associated with that package happen to be running. Normally, in a regular system that's not doing that much, 99% of the system idle is associated with system idle process. And when a package actually begins deployment, the MSI exec.exe process tends to kick up here for a second. So that tends to be kind of a good indicator that something is actually going on this system. Hopefully, well, as you can see, WinZip gets installed. I don't know if you noticed, but I was pausing for effect, or I was burning time to hopefully see if WinZip got installed. And if I run it, well, as you can see, there's WinZip. It's ready to go. So there is the WinZip installation, and let me get here. I need to close this out. But there is a successful installation of WinZip into this environment. Pretty cool. I mean, if you follow pretty much the steps from this point on, you're eventually going to get to the part where, well, you can see that WinZip actually successfully gets copied out to the various machines in your environment. And the other machines will catch up. I'm hoping to actually get some error messages here, but it's going to take a minute or two before the clients actually update this. In fact, I can speed things up a second time if I want by going back to Control Panel, back to Configuration Manager, and then just rerunning some of these cycles again. That will speed up the reporting back of the success or failure of the installation back to Configuration Manager. You will find yourself sort of doing this, or there are a number of little tools that you can download that'll speed that process, but you'll find yourself doing that quite a bit, at least in the early days while you're waiting for some of this stuff to come out. Now, I also told you that I put together an AppV client installation up here, this whole package and program for the AppV client. And the reason why I didn't show it to you first is because it actually has two different programs that are associated with it. The first is a client, and the second is the client plus the hotfix. And I did this because the hotfix has to happen after the installation of the client. So it gives me an example to show you how, first of all, I use the MSI exec /p to apply the hotfix, which is an MSP file, as you can see here. So that /p is what the command line switch is for MSPs. The reinstall equals all and reinstall mode equals OMUS is a common string that's used when deploying MSPs via Config Manager. That's just one of those little tricks that you learn over the years. I've set it so that Config Manager restarts the computer after that happens. Then here, under, let's see here, it's not here, it is here. Before I can actually deploy the hotfix, I have to deploy the AppV client first. And that program is the AppV client. Okay, so this gives you an idea of how I would create a multi-part package. So the first one here is the AppV client itself. It's a setup.exe, and then the silencing switches are here, /s/v/qn. Notice no space here between v and qn. And then once that's done, the second part actually is the SP1 plus hotfix 5. So this gives you an idea of, again, a much more complex package and some of the other variables that you're going to have to sleuth to figure out to install that application. I told you this wasn't going to be easy. It's not easy. It is exceptionally powerful, but it is not easy. And that's okay. The more time that you spend packaging software and really understanding how that packaging software works, the better of an IT professional you get. In fact, I'll argue, And I've said this before, and I'll say it again, that's the SMS admins, just like the RDS admins, if you were in one of my previous nuggets. The SMS admins are some of the smartest people in an IT organization because they're the ones that have to know extremely deep level detail about exactly how to get software on systems, both on and off. So if you invest the effort here in learning all of this, well, the reward is when you actually get that client installed. In fact, there's my WinZip. It's actually succeeded now. When you actually get those clients installed, well, you become the person who can save the day because you can deploy out that application with guaranteed success very easily and right to all the machines that need it overnight with a 100% success rate. It'll take you some time. You're not going to learn this overnight. This, as I'm telling you here, is just the beginning. So you've got a lot of personal learning and a lot of the art forms still left to figure out. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We have talked about the old way of doing software distribution. We talked about how packages and programs define the content, or the what, collections are the where, and deployments are the when. We talked about how Microsoft says that even though there is this new way of deploying software, the old way is handy for a certain set of circumstances. I showed you both directly and indirectly, if you'll notice that was done on purpose, how to build the package that is required to get the AppV client installed. Now, if you were watching this, a year down the road, and there may be some other requirements, but for right now, here today, this is what's required to get the AppV client installed. So now you know. You know what the programs need to be. You just got to go get the AppV client. You got to get that correct hotfix in order to make it happen. So little Easter egg there for you. Also showed you how to configure client settings, the software distribution site component, how to set up your DP, and then how to create and deploy a package and a program. You are now completely aware of how to do things the old way. Coming up next, we will talk about how to do things the new way, and I think you'll be very impressed. But until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.